In 2006, I read Dale Allison's book, Resurrecting Jesus, and he covered something very interesting in there, the phenomenon of apparitions. Now, apparitions broadly defined as the appearance of a spirit being. And sometimes these apparitions could be translucent, or kind of like a ghost, or sometimes they can be quite physical in their appearance and could even be touched, can appear to groups on occasion. It's pretty interesting. And Dale said that these apparitions, the study of apparitions, are heuristically profitable for understanding the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. In his 2021 book, he expounded on this even further. Pretty interesting stuff. And so I wanted to invite a guest to come on to talk about apparitions because he studied them quite extensively. Jonathan Kendall is a medical doctor. He is a nephrologist. That is a kidney doctor. He lives in Kentucky, works there. He is a Kentucky Wildcats fan and also Cincinnati Reds, Cincinnati Bengals fan. He is on the board of our ministry, Risen Jesus, and he's become a dear friend and has always been a brother. And he's here to talk about his new book, Seeing the Messiah, in which he is talking about these apparitions and the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. So, Jonathan, thanks.
Thank you for having me. I think that was a good intro. I think that says a little bit about me.
Yeah. I know there's a lot more, but hey, first question for you. Did you know that the Baltimore Ravens are favored to win the AFC East division this year?
I did know that, Mike, actually. And unfortunately, I can't say that's a bad pick because the Bengals defense is going to be a very uncertain situation this year.
Okay, well, let's hop into this and let's talk about your book.
Okay.
What initially got you interested in the phenomenon of apparitions?
Well, as you know, Mike, the Lubavitcher Reb, he's a messianic figure of the early middle to late 20th century and headquartered in Brooklyn, New York. Some of his followers claimed not only that he is the Messiah, but also that he had been raised from the dead. So, as you know, some of the skeptics out there are saying, look, Christianity is not so unique after all. So that really got me interested in the subject. And I realized, okay, besides the fact that there are claims, is there anything more substantial to that? And I eventually ran into these cases where the Reb was actually seen, just like Jesus was. And so I realized I needed to look into that, the apparitions literature a little bit more. Dale Allison was a big inspiration to me, his 2005 and his 2021 book as well. And then Jake O'Connell wrote a book on it, I believe it was in 2017. So those were my initial inspirations that got me essentially interested in that line of thought, that subject. So I went back to some of the initial sources, and of course I was blown away by what I found, the evidentiary nature of objective apparitions in nature.
Okay. Now, in your book, and listen, I've for the viewers out there, I've read this book, and it is a great book. Very interesting, very challenging, okay? Some of you are going to read this book. Well, probably many of you are going to read it and say, yikes, what do we do with some of this stuff, especially if you're just not familiar, haven't heard about it previously. So, Jonathan, in the book, you mentioned what's called psi and super psi.
Yes.
What is psi? What is super psi? And how does that relate to the study of the resurrection of Jesus?
Psi, PSI, after the Greek letter, is essentially shorthand for the word psychic. So when we talk about psi, we're talking about psychic phenomena such as telepathy, that is mind-to-mind influence, usually between one person and another, although it can be between a person and an animal, or mind-to-matter influence. So that would be psychokinesis or telekinesis. Having glimpses of the future, seeing the future, that's precognition, or retrocognition, having a glimpse of the past that turns out upon investigation sometimes to be accurate. That would be psi. And super psi is just a word commonly used in the literature to refer to dramatic examples of that occur in nature. Like sometimes mediums at a seance table on a really good night, you're seeing a lot of these paranormal acts. That might be referred to as super psi.
So, all right, there's discussions that occur about whether consciousness can survive outside the body. So, how does this impact that? And resurrection, of course.
Sure. Well, I think it actually increases our confidence that consciousness can out survive the body. And one thing maybe we'll talk about a little bit, but near-death experiences come into that as well. But I think even if you put the idea of near-death experiences aside, I think the fact that if you say that this kind of phenomena exists, this psi phenomenon, it probably exists when the body expires, or more specifically, the brain expires as well, although we can't know that for sure.
Now, you talk about spontaneously occurring apparitions. What are they?
When I say spontaneous, what I mean by that are apparitions that just occur with no deliberate action on the part of either the seer or somebody else. There are, and this admittedly throws a wrench into the whole question, there are cases in the literature where apparitions are generated deliberately. Sometimes it's been done without say you have a person who is the agent of the apparition. They say, well, I'm going to try, it'd be like me saying, I'm going to try to produce an apparition of myself to Mike Licona.
Mm-hmm.
And so I concentrate maybe one night and I imagine how that's going to appear. I don't tell Mike about it. And then a little bit later on, Mike calls me and says, hey, guess what? I just saw an apparition of you in my house. So unless that's one heck of a coincidence, probably something on my part caused that to occur.
Now, this is something I've just never heard of before, apart from studying your book. I mean, people can actually be deliberate in causing someone to see an apparition of themselves?
It has been done before. Unfortunately, most of the best cases are from some of the heyday of the Society for Psychical Literature, which is that was a British group of Cambridge scholars and philosophers that got together and studied these things. And in some of their seminal work, like the Senses of Hallucinations and the Phantasms of the Living, there's a number of cases, I believe about 15 of them, that are pretty evidentially sound.
So how do people try to, if they're trying to be deliberate in creating an apparition, how do they go about? We're not encouraging people to do that, but
no, please don't.
How do they go about doing it?
Well, they essentially just concentrate really hard on it. And I think there's something to, some people have the gift, so to speak, over others. Some people have those psychic gifts.
Yeah.
But it also seems to involve an altered state of consciousness. So when the Society for Psychical Research did this, and they said, we're going to take a person and we're going to try to project an apparition to some person living in maybe a village 10 miles from here, sometimes they would hypnotize the person that was trying to produce the apparition.
Okay.
And then sometimes the person would go to sleep after they were concentrating on it. They would actually go to sleep in the process. And then when checking with the percipient later, they found out that the apparition had occurred about shortly after the time that person projecting it fell asleep.
I know what you mean by saying that some people seem to have like kind of, maybe we call it psychical gifting, some kind of abilities that most of us don't have. I remember a friend of ours, her name's Pat Ferguson. And when we lived in Virginia Beach, we were really good friends. My wife and I were really good friends with her and her husband, Doug. And I can remember being with Doug I think it was at a baseball game. They had a minor league team up there, AAA for the Mets at the time, the Tidewater Tides. And I believe Doug and I were at one of their games when he told me the story that the week before, I think it was, he brought his 3 sons to a game, and their church that they attended was getting a brand new pastor. They just got a brand new pastor, and that pastor had just come and sit down like 3 rows in front of them. And so he calls Pat and says, "Hey, Pat, you'll never guess who just arrived here at the stadium." And she said she saw it in her mind. She said, "It's the new pastor. He's 3 rows in front of you, and he just looked to the left." And as she said that, he was doing it. It's like, how do you do that? You know? Now this was over 20 years ago. You know, I don't think there was FaceTime or anything like that back then. So I mean, that was interesting. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, I can't do that. I don't want to encourage someone to try to do that, but it just comes. That kind of stuff came naturally to her.
Sure.
Um,
I believe we have a mutual friend that has had similar experiences. What you describe as a glimpse into the future, into the brief or into the near future, and that we'd call that precognition, in essence.
okay.
Yeah. So, and it was spontaneous because she didn't try to conjure it up. Most of these kinds of things, contrary to the deliberately produced apparitions that we discussed, most of these are more what I'd call spontaneous. They just seem to happen.
So, like these apparitions that some people see at seances, they're seen by groups.
Right.
They're not just seen by one person. So, if they're seen by a group, it's like, well, this isn't a hallucination, especially if they're all claiming to see the same thing. Those are more impressive than just a spontaneous apparition that happens at some point. You know, like maybe you're just sitting there and, I mean, Dale Allison talks about one where I think he was in the room working in his office or something like that at home. And he saw the apparition of a friend who had died behind him or in front of him, something like that. That's a spontaneous. But when you've got a group who claim to see the same person, that's pretty impressive. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, and that's really where there seems to be a disconnect because group apparitions, even well-attested ones in the literature, especially when you go back to the Society for Psychical Research, that literature, they found that when an apparition occurred, when a group was present, first of all, it usually didn't occur to more than maybe a few people, maybe 7 or 8 at the most, as a general rule, and usually it was in smaller groups. But when an apparition would appear to a group, only about a third to maybe half the time did everyone in the group see it. It may be only 2 out of 3 see it, or 3 out of 5 people see it. But in these seances, you would have groups of 12, 25, sometimes I think even I found a case where 55 people claimed to be present. And at least by way of inference, we don't have, unfortunately, interviews with all of these different people to confirm this, but by inference, the narrative suggested that everybody there actually could see the apparition. So what do I make of that? I think when you have seances, you bring expectation to the fore. And so the skeptic might say, well, you're talking about a hallucination there when that occurs. But I don't think that explains it because even when expectation is present, you've got multiple people who essentially see the same thing. So that doesn't really work. But when you have a group of people that seem to believe, and they're supposedly, if it's a legitimate medium, and there's a lot of fraudsters out there as far as mediums go, but if it's a legitimate person that seems to have that gift, and you have a number of sitters there, it seems to increase that energy in the room. So when you have an apparition materialize, it's more likely to be seen by more people present than when a spontaneous apparition would occur.
What do you do with those instances? Well, let's say there's 10 people and 6 of them see it, but 4 don't. Are the 6, do they claim to see the same thing?
Generally speaking, yes.
So how would you explain that 6 see it, but 4 don't?
Well, that's a matter of speculation, but
Kind of like for those of you who are, maybe a lot of you won't this won't click with you, but when I was a kid, I'm 64 now, and when I was a kid, I used to watch the Flintstones when I'd come home from school, and there was this alien, an ET called Kazoo. Did you ever watch it?
I was more of a Scooby-Doo person. So.
Scooby-Doo. So Kazoo was this alien. He had this like helmet on and these 2 antennae that would come up, and he would appear to Fred and Barney. and Dino, the pet dinosaur, could see Kazoo, but Wilma and Betty, the two wives of Fred and Barney, could not see Kazoo. So it's like, but he was there. So it's like, how do you appear and only some you make it so only some can see? Kazoo made it so only they could see it, but Wilma and Betty could not. Is that what kind of something like that? Is that what's going on with these apparitions where only certain members of the group can see and others can't?
I think that there's probably a sensitivity level of the different recipients. And in cases like that, where only maybe 2 out of 3 see it or 3 out of 5. And to be sure, there are cases of seances where I think I remember seeing a case where there was 3 out of 7 saw it. I think some of those that just happen to see it are just more sensitive.
Okay.
And in the cases where you have multiple people, especially when you're talking about 10, 20 people or more seeing it, apparently the energy, and I don't know if I'm describing this right or not, because it's a matter of speculation, but I think in those cases, the energy is just so strong that everybody, regardless of how sensitive they are, can see it.
Are there examples where there might be like 10 people at a seance and all of them see it? Or you mentioned something where there was like 60-something people. Did they all see it?
Carlos Mirabelli, who was a Brazilian spiritist, he really produced some, I guess, outstanding phenomena. We're talking about basically the whole repertoire of psychic activity. He produced materializations of people that have been deceased. He would do automatic writing. He would go into a trance and speak dozens of languages that he didn't know. I think he produced materializations of 50 plus people that 50 plus people were able to see. But these dramatic instances where dozens upon dozens of people saw them is not, that's rare even in seance literature, even in cases of mediumship. But when you see those kinds of cases, it seems to be in where they were deliberately produced. And yet, I don't think hallucination works because people see essentially the same thing, or at least very similar things. So I think something paranormal did take place. Carl Gustav Jung, he was one of the first, basically one of the fathers, I think Sigmund Freud's considered the father of psychology, but one of his predecessors, or at least contemporaries, interestingly, he was at a seance with 5 people, and suddenly the medium produced this globe, shaped like a moon, looked like a moon-shaped globe that was ethereal. Of the 5 people present, 4 of them saw it. 1 of them did not. He was the one that claimed that he could not see it. So
Okay.
even in these cases, there are situations where people cannot see it. But it does seem like the success rate is much higher in these cases of mediumship.
This is interesting stuff.
Very interesting.
You know, I would guess some of our viewers right now are feeling a little uncomfortable. It's like, why are you talking about this psychical stuff? It's so different. It's bizarre. And my answer to that would be because it's real. You can't just, if you're really in search for truth, you can't just blow something away and ignore it and just discount it automatically because it just doesn't fit comfortably within your worldview or the way you presently think of reality. If this stuff is real, if it's real, we want to know about it. How does it fit into a worldview? Well, that's something we got to wrestle with. How would you answer that question? If someone said, some of the things you're talking about now, apparitions and like seances and stuff like that, now you're getting into some bizarre stuff. You're getting away from your typical stuff of historical evidence and talking about this. It's experiential stuff. And they might want to just like, nah, that's just rubbish. How would you answer that?
Well, I would say kind of like you, there are so many cases in the literature, and that was one of the things that was a surprise to me. All these cases were studied, analyzed, written up by very serious people, starting with the Society for Psychical Research in the 1880s. And there's people today that have picked up that mantle. I think if I were to recommend one book, if you really want to look at psi and really give it a fair chance, there's a book called Irreducible Mind that was written by a number of authors. They've the content of the actual book is excellent, but they have an appendix with scores of different references where you can go for further reading on this material. And so when you look at it on a case-by-case basis, some of the cases are weak. You might have one witness, and the witness might be questionable. On the other hand, you might have several very good witnesses that have been willing to sign affidavits. Yeah, and to be sure, the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, they've written tens of thousands of pages, and they are to be, I think, applauded for their efforts, because even in their day, this was stigmatizing research, right? This was information that you better have all your ducks in a row if you're going to present it. And to be sure, they presented some cases that have proven to be illegitimate at later times. And yet, if you look at the sum total of their data, both the modern researchers and the researchers that go back to the late 19th century, the evidence, not maybe on any individual case, but the cumulative evidence is just overwhelming that this stuff exists. Now, what do you do with it? I'll be honest with you, Mike, that put me into a metaphysical crisis in 2022. And I talk about this at the beginning of my book. I thought, here we are, we're steeped in the West, Western philosophy, Western science. So I always thought materialism, scientific materialism, would be where I would struggle if I would ever lose faith. It's not that at all. As far as I'm concerned, scientific materialism is dead. It's just been destroyed by the psychical research literature because it is just so impressive. But what do you do with some of this stuff? There are some things, and we haven't gotten into some of the things that seem to contradict our Judeo-Christian beliefs, but they are out there, and I'm honestly not sure what to do with it. I'm not sure that it ever will.
Well, what do you see that may contradict or challenge the Judeo-Christian or the Christian worldview?
Okay, well, you've got near-death experiences. Okay, let's start there. You've got some near-death experiences where people see Jesus, they see traditional conceptions of heaven, or at least a lot of near-death experiences that are not necessarily, they're at least compatible, if not directly linked to our worldview. But then in the East, so Osis and Haraldson, they wrote a book called At the Hour of Death, where they study a lot of American versions of these kinds of things, near-death experiences, deathbed visions, those kinds of things. And they find out that the Indians, that is Asian Indians, tend to have near-death experiences and deathbed visions that are consistent with their beliefs. They see Hindu deities. They see Yamduts come to get them. Yamduts, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's those are messengers of the god Yamaraj, which is the Hindu god of death. So in theory, if our belief was true, we would say they should all at least be in some way compatible with the Christian worldview. They are not. That would be one thing. One thing I've not studied in any amount of depth would be past life memories. The typical situation would be of a 6, 7, 8-year-old child. He or she becomes sure that he or she was originally somebody else, and they might describe details of a person that lives in a nearby village or a nearby town, very obscure details that turn out upon investigation to be correct. Something paranormal is clearly going on there. The people that have these experiences would say that's proof of reincarnation, which, as you know, that's not exactly compatible with a traditional view of Christianity as well.
Yeah, it doesn't say, except the person be born again and again and again, right?
Right. Now, there were some later Christian sects that I understand took up reincarnation, but I don't think it's ever generally been an orthodox view within the Christian community. The other thing I think worth mentioning, at least for us evangelicals, is the Marian apparitions. What do you do with those? Because there's no doubt in my mind that some of these Marian apparitions are objectively true, such as Fatima probably serving as the apogee of said apparitions.
So, yeah, and this third one, the Marian apparitions, that doesn't really call into question the Christian worldview, though.
Sure.
The near-death experiences of where, let's say, Asian Indians see something that's related to their gods. Let me ask you, and I know if we're talking about near-death experiences, we're getting off topic a little bit. I don't know if you've studied it enough to be able to answer this, but there's a lot of near-death experiences. While interesting, they're not really evidenced. So it's something that might be able to happen that has maybe some residual brain activity that's going on. It's those that have a lot of evidence that the percipient, while dead, receives some accurate information they could not have otherwise known. So, for example, maybe they learn of the death of someone in their family that lived on a different side of the country or in another country. They didn't know that they were dead, had just died because maybe they got in a car accident or something like that around the same time that this person had died, and they see them in heaven, and they learn that they had just died at that point. I mean, that kind of stuff is impressive.
Agreed.
So are there any like that of which you are aware of, let's say, Hindus or Buddhists or Muslims who have a very pleasant, heavenly kind of near-death experience that's evidence like that?
Off the top of my head, no. A phenomenon that they talk about in India I think the authors claim that they were aware of 5 of them. And this raises the question about the authenticity of near-death experiences altogether, admittedly, but there are occasions when a messenger comes to get the person. They're on their deathbed and they're taken to some heavenly realm, and there's a person there. You might call that person an angel or what have you. And that person has a book open before them. So he said, okay, this must be the judgment. And instead, they're surprised. That person says, you've got the wrong person. Tells the messenger, you got the wrong person, take them back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so that person's taken back. They're back in their body. And at the same time, there's stories of a person with the same name in the same hospital dying at about that time.
Okay.
I would consider that evidential. Now, that being said, I don't know how evidential they are because
it doesn't prove that their particular religious beliefs are correct, though, right?
No, it wouldn't. I guess it wouldn't. Yeah, that's true, because that could be in theory. It raises the question of the authenticity of them in general, because do they really make those kinds of errors in heaven? You could ask that question, but yeah, I guess that's true. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
I guess the angel didn't earn its wings.
Perhaps. Yeah, you wouldn't think they would make
Clarence, you're going to have we'll give you another chance.
You wouldn't think clerical errors would happen in heaven, but who are we to say, right?
Yeah.
But I would say, not that I know of, I figure they exist, but that would be a good study to know that. Now, I will say this, though. People that have had near-death experiences will commonly be changed, not only in terms of their outlook on life, they'll be more spiritual, they're commonly more altruistic. A lot of times they're changed people, and that happens regardless of whether you're in the Christian tradition or not. I am comfortable telling you that. And sometimes they'll have these psychic after effects. They'll claim after their near-death experience that they'll start having these visions of the future, these glimpses. So precognitive experiences, they're more likely to see apparitions, or they're more likely to have mystical experiences. Things like that happen. So, and I can tell you at least some of these people that have near-death experiences compatible with alternative religious beliefs, they definitely have some of these after effects. And I think that's a level of evidence as well.
All right. So there was the near-death experiences. There was something else. The second thing that you said.
Past life memories.
Oh, yeah. Like with reincarnation. Have you given that any serious thought about what that's all about?
Well, we know that we have good reason to believe that dissociation happens. So dissociation is essentially a term that psychologists use to mean that when a person's in an altered state of consciousness, they might be closer to a realm where these psychic effects are more likely to happen. And so we've talked about people that have split identity disorders or multiple personality disorders. The official term for that nowadays is called dissociative identity disorder, or DID. So could it be that they are essentially not only the fact that they have these beliefs of this alternate personality is that, and then the fact that they're able to obtain veridical information that there's no way they could have known otherwise through this dissociative process. I think that's a possibility. There are cases in the literature of people that have had transplants, and they've gotten a transplanted organ. They might happen. They usually try to keep this process secretive, but there might be occasions or situations where that person will meet the family of the deceased, and they'll notice very similar personality quirks. It's almost like they took on some of that person's essence who was the transplant donor.
Interesting.
That's fairly well attested in the literature. So that would be a way out of the reincarnation phenomenon. But I will say, I think it's fair to say that most of those people that have past life memories, this is not definitive, but they believe they're having them because they were truly someone else in a former life.
You know, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who subscribe to my YouTube channel, winners, good people, and those dirtbags who don't. Which one are you?
Now, some of this, you're a medical doctor. Medical doctors are considered to be quite smart, intelligent.
There are exceptions, but yeah.
So you share this? Do you share any of this stuff with your colleagues, your medical colleagues? If so, what's their response?
A few of my closest friends, I will talk about it some. Now, as I was writing this book, I didn't tell a whole lot of people about it, except for some of my closest friends who are also medical colleagues. Yeah, and one of them seems open to it, and another one that I've talked to a lot about it and had a lot of enlightening experiences. He's an atheist, and he basically just says, if I don't see it, I'm not going to believe it. I don't care how good the evidence seems otherwise from these case studies. That's pretty much it. But I think some of my more spiritual colleagues would be open to it. And I've talked to some others. I shouldn't just say it's those two. There are some others, and I think those that tend to believe that it confirms their beliefs, they're certainly open to it. And I don't think it's converted too many atheists, but I've only talked to the one about it that really has more of a beliefs that's more consistent with scientific materialism than some kind of theology or some kind of worldview that would accommodate the paranormal.
Okay, so let's talk some more about your book. In chapter 3, you deal with what is called the fifth experiment at a distance of 9 miles. And you said that had a profound impact on you. What is the fifth experiment? And tell us about it and how that impacted you.
In one of the seminal works of the Society for Psychical Research, this shows up in Phantasms of the Living. Can't remember which volume. It's a 2-volume work. But it's about this person that tried to project apparitions to other people. And the best example of it, and what's interesting, he was trying to project apparitions to people in a dream. So he concocted this scenario in his head where the percipient was to receive in a dream, for instance, have a dream of a funeral procession. And then when the dreamer goes up to the coffin, looks inside the coffin and sees this person that had been deceased, someone that they both knew. Well, that worked to perfection, but the one thing that was exceptional is it was the person projecting the apparition who was the corpse, not the person that had died. So that was one of those experiments. That's not the fifth experiment at 5 miles. Okay, and I just did that as an introductory. The fifth experiment at a distance of 5 miles, essentially, he intended to project the apparition to a percipient in a dream. But at that time, the percipient happened to be awake and in the company of another person. Okay. And so this apparition of a deceased lady, someone that's been deceased 5 years, walks in the room, basically nods and leaves. And then they try to find her, and she's nowhere to be seen. And the guards, they didn't see her. She was clearly an apparition. Okay. And then.
So it'd be like, all right, my mom died 12 years ago. It'd be as though I was trying to cause my sister to see an apparition of my mom. and my sister's husband is there as well, and they both see it. Is it kind of like that? Okay. Wow.
Yes, it was only intended to go to the one recipient, but another person happened to be present and happened to see the lady too.
Okay.
Okay. And actually, I misspoke a minute ago. You did not. It's a fifth experiment at 9 miles, not 5 miles.
So what are the implications of this? Why did this have a profound impact on you?
So this is one of those kind of vivid moments, like you remember where you're at 9/11, or you remember where you're at when Kentucky won the 1996 national title, for instance. It's just very vivid because it's an important life event for you. I remember my wife, she was out on our back porch making steaks, and one of my friends was on the way over to the house. I remember that much about it. It hit me like a ton of bricks, because then it begs the question, okay, if an apparition of a dead person can be produced by a living person, then how do we know that all apparitions of dead people were not produced either on purpose or most often inadvertently by living people? So whenever for people, for instance, that see a deceased loved one, they wake up, they have what I call in chapter 7 a reunion apparition. We know that a lot of people, they'll have these visual aspects. They'll see an apparition of a deceased loved one. They'll usually feel better. How do we know that that wasn't inadvertently produced by someone else? That's it. I think this case and a few others like it, I've run into the literature, throws that into question, unfortunately. And that's why it had such a big impact. And it also extends to religious figures. If we could produce a vision of a deceased person, or why not? Why could we not produce one of, say, of Jesus, for instance?
What do you think? There was this, in the late 1960s in Zaytun, Egypt, there was the apparition of Mary, of Virgin Mary, right? And she appeared differently to different people and never spoke. Do you think that could be someone that deliberately produced that apparition that could be seen by thousands of people?
I would say in theory, but in practice, probably not, because you're right, that apparition was seen by thousands of people. Fatima, while Mary herself was only seen by the 3 children, tens of thousands of people saw the miracle of the sun.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that you can do that, especially when you get back to the seance material. You're talking about a lot of different people, all with like-minded, holding hands, putting themselves into an altered state of consciousness around someone that theoretically is very talented or gifted at that kind of thing. And then you produce apparitions, and there have been some rare occurrences of apparitions seen by many people, as we discussed earlier. But when you're talking about thousands, and the Zaytun case and the Fatima presumably would have been done inadvertently by somebody, that would be too much. I think that's beyond the limits of what that could explain, which I think that's a good thing.
Now, there have been some cases where someone either saw the Virgin Mary or went to one of those sites where she was seen by others, and they get healed. What do you make of that? What do you think that is? Is she actually healing them? Well, yeah, tell me what you think of that.
I like to think so. I like to think that that's really God or some benevolent angel, or who knows, maybe even the Blessed Virgin herself healing these people. That's what I like to believe. Now, when you get into the healings, though, again, you've got cases where healings have been done in other contexts. Back in the late 18th, early 19th century, you got the mesmerists, the hypnotists, people that would hypnotize people, and they'd come up with cures. And they would cure things that were done basically that were not were untreatable at the time by current medical technology. Debunkers tend to scoff at that data, but honestly, I think the data is strong enough that probably really did happen. So is it possible that, say, someone that goes into an altered state of consciousness produces an apparitional drama, and that apparition comes and heals them? Because we know that there's apparitions of Jesus, there's apparitions of Mary, other religious figures that come and heal that person seemingly miraculously. Was that somehow produced by the subliminal consciousness of that person, or maybe that person and others? Maybe you could even argue prayer produces that as well. we've got a certain person in mind, a bunch of people, we pray, we close our minds. A lot of people go into altered states of consciousness. You could argue that maybe that's just psychokinesis at a distance, and that's why some people are healed, or why that seems, at least anecdotally, to work.
Psychokinesis, what's the difference between that and psychosomatic?
Psychosomatic would be where you're healed. Say if I have a pain in my back, you suggest that, if you keep running, like, I'm not a runner, but it's a bad example. But if you keep running too much, you're going to get a pain in your back. And I wake up the next day. That would be and then someone, like, let's say you give me a medicine, you give me a couple of Tylenol, and I feel better about an hour from now, and you say, aha, that was actually just a sugar pill. Yeah. That would be a psychosomatic cause. Although even in psychosomatic causes, you could argue it's a matter of mind over matter.
Yeah. So, some of these healings, by being there with the Virgin Mary, thinking they saw her, that could be psychosomatic, couldn't it? Some of them?
It could, although in some cases you have limbs that are fractured or that have been mangled for years that are suddenly healed. You've got metastatic cancer that's gone into remission. There are well-tested cases of that. So what do you do with that?
All right. So earlier, toward the beginning of this, when we talked about what led you into this, we talked about the Rebbe. So again, remind us, who is the Rebbe? Why is he important in the study of apparitions?
The Rebbe was a messianic figure. He was a famous Jewish rabbi that I believe he was a leader for years, decades actually, and died in 1994. But very charismatic figure. He led a mystical sect, the Hasidic Jews, Chabad, Chabad, and some of them thought he's going to declare himself to be the Messiah. Well, unfortunately, he had a stroke and he was really largely disabled, but he was able to go to a lot of the services and the Jewish festivals and holy days after that. Now, in 1994, I believe that was the right year, he passed away. And some people were so faithful, they thought he was going to get up and walk even then, that he's going to be raised. He wasn't. Some other believers, it's a peripheral group within that sect, but some other Hasidic believers believed that he has been raised, and some have actually seen the Reb. They've claimed to have had visual appearances of him.
So, how are the appearances of the Rebbe different from appearances of the risen Jesus to his disciples?
Well, let's talk about the similarities first,
okay.
Because you have one rabbi that had recurrent appearances of the Reb. Now, interestingly, this rabbi that's mentioned in the literature, he's had a lot of spiritual experiences, but I think he claimed that the Reb appeared to him 6 times. It was always just to him. But you have some cases where he appeared to 2 or 3 people. At once, you have one case where he appeared to 7, okay? I believe some of these claimed appearances, especially the solo, were probably subjective, that they were hallucinations. They weren't real,
okay,
because they happen in very charged religious settings. A lot of the visions people have of the Reb resemble pictures, paintings of the Reb,
okay,
especially at the Brooklyn headquarters where the Reb held out his ministry. But then you have some of the ones that are more difficult to explain are the group appearances. And then you've got a few cases of what I call rescue apparitions. The Rebbe was involved with that as well. I know there was one case of a lady that was in Israel and the bus was being shot at by terrorists, Palestinians. And so she had a vision of the Rebbe and said, "You need to get down into the floor of the bus right now." She did. She was spared. The person beside her was shot and ended up dying. So that's what I'd call a rescue apparition. There was one case where there was a diver who something went wrong, was about to drown. He got saved by 2 people. And when he got up above the surface of the water and he came to, there was a person standing over him and said, "Thanks for saving my life, but where's the other person?" The other diver said, "No, I'm the only one that was here." Well, later on, this person that was saved saw the picture of a Rebbe in a photograph, and he didn't recognize me. He said, that was the other person. That was the other person that saved me. I'm not even sure if this person was Jewish, the diver. But some of those cases can't really be explained away as hallucinations. I believe they are consistent with apparitions, though. As far as Jesus is concerned, what we have with him, and at the book, I make three different sets of assumptions in the closing chapters. I take 1 Corinthians 15 and try to say, okay, if we just take the appearance date in 1 Corinthians 15, since it's widely agreed upon by scholars to represent basically what happened, does the apparitions theory stand? And I find even if we just use that, maybe the Zaytun appearances of Mary can match that, but that's about it. If you take the empty tomb, if you add that to the data, that makes it even harder to explain the references of Jesus. So for the Rebbe, there are people that make processions or pilgrimages to his gravesite, and every year there's a celebration, I believe, the day of his death. So the vast majority, even those that claim to believe he is the Messiah, and that that he has been risen, most of them will acknowledge there would be a corpse there or bones there in the tomb if you were to dig it up. From what we can tell from early Christianity, at least based on the Gospel of Mark and beyond, ladies found the tomb empty, and we have that tradition, whereas the Rebbe does not. And then if you take, and we're getting into more dicey territory here with the post-resurrection appearances in Matthew, Luke, and John, but if we accept those as historical, those are just robustly physical. You've got, now to be sure, there are apparitions that have consumed food, so more along those lines, but Jesus appears to 12 people. You don't see that too much among spontaneous apparitions. He appeared to 500. He ate food on multiple occasions.
He cooked breakfast and wine.
He cooked breakfast. He even performed a miracle, another miraculous catch. So the more history that we find in those narratives, the more it appears that Jesus's appearances were something different. Now, our problem with that, as you know, is that when we start admitting that as evidence, we run into a lot of resistance in the scholarly community.
Sure, who won't grant the historicity of those accounts, at least as we read them today.
Right.
How has all of this? I mean, before this, you're a Christian, so you believed in an afterlife before this. How has all this study about apparitions, has it impacted your view of an afterlife, your belief in an afterlife?
Let me make one more addition to what I was saying too. A difference, and this is an important difference between the Rebbe and Jesus. Mm-hmm. A lot of the Messianists, those that believe that Rebbe is the Messiah and was somehow raised, and it was believed that he was raised into a different reality that we cannot see. That's why they can visit his tomb and at the same time claim that he was raised.
Okay.
But it was also in a peripheral group. Most of the original leaders of Chabad were not sanguine on the idea that the Rebbe was raised. Some of them hold out hope that he will be raised and that he'll be proven to be the Messiah. But as far as we can tell, these apparitions occurred to Jesus's core group, and I think that's important.
Would you say those on the Rebbe who claim to have seen apparitions of him, are they a fringe group? Would you go that far?
I think most of them, especially the ones that have I think most of them are Messianists, and most of the ones that have experienced hallucinations, what I would think are probably hallucinations of him in charged religious atmospheres, those are also mostly Messianists as well. There are a few outsiders, though. I think I mentioned one. I believe, and I'm open to correction on this, but I think that diver, I don't know that he was necessarily a follower of the Rebbe. Okay. And there was another case I don't mention in the book, but where I believe it was a physician happened to see someone on the roadside saved amidst a car accident, and there was this figure that was there, and then later on he didn't know who this figure was, but he saw a picture and he said that was the one, that was the guy saving this person during this car crash. That was the Rebbe. So I think the leaders of Chabad, the more centralized group that don't make overt claims of messiahship for the Rebbe, I don't tend to think that I think that they would probably call those that do a fringe group. I don't think that's unfair to say.
So, all right, you have said with some of these appearances of the Rebbe, you think that they're hallucinations. Um, why wouldn't you say that about some of the appearances of Jesus?
Well, the appearances of the Rebbe that occur to 2 or 3, or the one that occurred to 7 people, I would say those aren't hallucinations either. Those were probably objectively produced apparitions. It was whether it was an apparition produced by living people in a charged religious environment, I believe something was produced, some objective impulse was produced to make them think they saw the Rebbe. Now, you could make the same claim about Jesus as well, but I think just the overtly physical aspects we find in the Gospels, the things that we mentioned just a few minutes ago, I just don't see it. I don't see that many overt displays. There is one case, and I talk about it in the book, and this happened in, I believe it was in India, where a Swami who was still alive essentially projected an apparition of himself into the homes of one of his followers, and through sign language, he asked his follower to give him some tea, and I think she brought back a tea and a biscuit. And anyway, some time passed. He disappeared. They went in there to find some of the tea was missing, half the biscuit was gone, and there was still a cigarette burning. So even apparitions apparently even consume food to some degree, but I think it was just the fact that Jesus's appearances represent all the best cases. It wasn't just the fact that he ate the food and cooked the food, but he also appeared to 12 people. He even had an appearance to 500 people per that important 1 Corinthians 15
Gotcha.
material.
Through.
I would also say the fact that the disciples were not expecting a resurrection, it would have taken something like what we see in the Gospels. Even if you want to say those aren't historical, it would take something with that level of evidence to make them unanimously agree that a resurrection, a bodily resurrection into a glorified body, is what occurred.
So, okay, so how has all of this study then, how's it impacted your belief in the resurrection of Jesus, since there are some similarities and differences?
I think apparitions are the best shot, but they can't explain everything. They can't explain the empty tomb, forgot to mention that. So I think when you take what, in my opinion, is the best alternative theory, and it is still found wanting.
Best alternative theory to what happened to Jesus.
If
you reject the resurrection of Jesus, you think this is better than hallucinations, theft, legend, that kind of stuff.
Correct.
Okay.
But it can't explain everything. And so my belief in the resurrection actually has increased as a result. The bodily, in a transcendent body, resurrection of Jesus has increased. What to do with some of this other data is another matter. It's kind of like, let's say you can order something from some kind of etheric Amazon. You could say, okay, and you can order it directly from God. Say, God, I just want to know what is the right way to believe? What is the proper worldview? Okay, and then you get that box and you open it, and there's all these pieces, and you have to put it together. You're not exactly sure what it's going to look like. And let's say that, okay, maybe Islam would represent a crescent moon, or maybe a traditional Talmudic Judaism would represent maybe the Star of David, or what have you. And let's say we put it together, and okay, it looks pretty good. We got a cross here, so I'm pretty comfortable. At the core event of the of Christianity, the linchpin is the resurrection. If Jesus was raised, Christianity, at least in some sense, is true. If he was not, then it's not true. I believe that. So I think that means that what I'm going to put together, what I'm putting together, looks an awful lot like a cross. But it might not be shaped exactly the way I had envisioned it, and there might be all these extra parts. And you pick up this bracket and say, this looks important, but you just put it aside because it doesn't seem to fit. So it's hard to get a clear picture. And I would say all this evidence overall, I will say super psi, apparitions of the living, the things we've talked about, that it really opens the question, is all this paranormal activity really just generated by the living? That throws another wrench into things. However, I think that the sum total of the evidence, even if you take out the resurrection, makes me believe even more strongly in an afterlife. And as far as I'm concerned, scientific materialism has been shattered.
Mm.
It's just absolutely been shattered. So part of my reality is Jesus was raised from the dead into a glorified, immortal body. And I think that gives vindication to his claims, which were very lofty, that he was somehow divine, that his death was important to humanity for atoning salvation. That doesn't mean it can't be applied to other people in ways that we may not traditionally in our kind of closed-minded thinking at times envision, but I believe that has to be somewhere in there. What to do with this other stuff, I'm not sure.
So, okay. Yeah, this is interesting stuff. You know what I appreciate about you and several of our board members? I mean, when I'm looking to bring someone to the board, I'm just like I was with you. I'm honest and say, look, some of the things I discuss can be controversial, right?
Sure.
And so our board members have to be okay with that. And what I appreciate about you, Jonathan, is, I mean, this is a difficult topic right here. And, you know, we try to, I mean, I think about the times that you, Bill Pratt and I have sat down at a meal or just talking on the phone or texting or something. And it's like, yeah, these are difficult things, but we don't shy away from them. We may not have all the answers. We're willing to wrestle with the stuff, but we want to acknowledge, we're willing to acknowledge at least a phenomena or something that's a challenge to us if it's there.
Right.
You know, we don't want to run away from it or just give a pat answer. This is a difficult one. I appreciate the fact that you have approached this in an honest manner, acknowledge where, you know, we still don't have maybe crystal clear answers for a lot of this stuff. But, you know, whereas there's some things that you acknowledge that it challenges some things about at least a traditional Christian worldview, you are still a Christian, a conservative Christian. We live with some unanswered questions, with some tensions, willing to keep working through and wrestling with these things, while we're focusing on things that we believe that we can know with some confidence, such as Jesus rising from the dead, because of the good evidence for it. And like you said, if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true, at least to some extent. That seems clear enough, at least to me. Do you have any final things that you would like to share?
I think I would say that here's what I believe as far as apparitions and some other things that are maybe coming down the pike. I think they tell us something about innate human abilities. They tell us something about the nature of reality that has yet to be discovered. So if we were to go back 200 years and we were to talk about boxes that you could turn a little circular dial and you could hear people talking from hundreds of miles away, or we tried to describe for them lights like light bulbs, television sets, internet, things like that would seem miraculous to them, just like apparitions do to us today. So I suspect, and I could be wrong, but I ultimately, and I'm not sure we'll get to live to see this day, but I suspect some kind of physical principle is going to be discovered, which will explain all of these things as well. And, you know, I think that's kind of where this is ultimately going. But I'd also say, as far as Jesus is concerned, if we're right, if the historical Jesus claimed that his death and resurrection would be important not only for the fulfillment of Scripture, which is an audacious enough claim, but that it would be important to set the salvation of humanity, that he was the Word of God incarnate. And if we can believe that the resurrection, to use Tom Wright's verbiage, that God essentially overturned the capital verdict by raising him from the dead into a new transcendent immortal body like we all hope to have, then he's probably someone that we should all take seriously.
Well stated. Hey, thanks, brother, for sharing. And look, if this is really a good book, so if you're wanting a challenging read, you want to see the data for yourselves. Get this book by Dr. Jonathan Kendall, Seeing the Messiah. You can get that on Amazon, probably some other places. I'm sure you can get it in Kindle, softcover, hardcover. Check it out. It's a really good book. Thanks, brother.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.